Some global media outlets have persistently continued propagating erroneous information about Ethiopia to the point of shocking some global reporters who stand by journalistic principles. The latest CNN and some others report about Ethiopia are cases in point here. And I'm joined by Bob Schlehuber, a Washington, D.C. based American journalist who is working for Sputnik News. And we'll be discussing current issues unfolding here in Ethiopia. In this edition of Addis Dialogue, with it, I'm Shifarao Lako and Desteras. Bob, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege and an honor to be here with you.
All right, Bob, as I said in my intro, Western media outlets seem bent on covering things which are not on the ground here. The latest case in point is the hysteria, if you will, that CNN has recently caused, as if Addis Ababa had been under siege of the terrorist forces. There were more than 20 stories published in just 24 hours in Ethiopia with same fake information. Luckily, you were here in Ethiopia and have seen the facts on the ground. Now, tell me, what are some of your observations here?
Yeah, I was in Ethiopia from November 2nd through November 6th, and I arrived at Bole International Airport and I opened my email once I had service again to an email from the US Embassy saying that all US citizens should immediately leave. And I wasn't about to get back on a plane and travel the 17 hours back. So I said, I'll stay a little bit and see what's going on for myself. And once you get to Addis Ababa, as your listeners know, there is not the conditions that are described by the CNN, the Washington Post, New York Times, and the US government. The city obviously is in a moment of great, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of fear. Obviously, people are very anxious around what is taking place, but the city itself was not under siege. I was able to take a tour of the city. I was able to meet quite a few people, and I was able to freely walk around on my own within Addis Ababa. And if there was a war, or if the city was under attack, I do not think I would be walking around the city by myself, casually taking in the sights, meeting people, getting great food. And so obviously what I saw actually being in the country, unlike so many of my colleagues in the news media here in the United States, is a completely different story.
Apart from pushing lies and falsehoods about Ethiopia, these Western media outlets are also trying to tarnish the image of the country, reporting exaggerated and horrific stories about the IDPs who fled their homes in various parts of the Amhara region, for example. Are there any observations that you made in this regard from your recent trip to Ethiopia, especially your visit to the state of Amhara?
Yeah. And, we often say that the US media is one-sided. And in this conflict, they're not just one-sided. They're actively working to push a side on behalf of the TPLF. And they're only highlighting those who are in a certain part of the country, not the whole country. So when I arrived to Ethiopia, I wanted the opportunity and flew to Bahar Dar to understand what was happening to the people of Afar and to Amhara. And so I arrived at Bahar Dar to what was going to be a retail center for the city that has now been turned into a makeshift camp for people who have been displaced from throughout the northern parts of the Amhara state and across from Dessie, Kombolcha, places like Lalibela, World Heritage sites that the TPLF has now invaded and destroyed people's homes that I heard stories about. People had been raped. I heard stories. People's livestock and their crops have all been destroyed. These are things that the Ethiopian government is not doing to the people of Tigray. They're not destroying crops. They're not purposely killing livestock. And I think what the American media has gotten so wrong is who's really suffering and why. It's not two sides are fighting, and because two sides are fighting, then there is damage. But the TPLF have been the aggressors. They are the ones who could end the war tomorrow if they demobilize, if they return to Tigray, if they put down their weapons. The war would instantly stop. The Ethiopian government has already declared a unilateral ceasefire. They said, we will stop fighting, and the TPLF continued. And so to actually travel to Amhara, to travel to Bahar Dar, and to hear people's stories directly, stories that are left out of American news, was quite enlightening. And I could not imagine it. And we were talking about how these people at these camps, the Ethiopians at these camps, they actually are more familiar and have read more American news than most Americans have, which tells you a lot about how little the American people read news here, unfortunately. But to be able to be in those camps and to read the news and watch yourself completely erased from history, erased from
Yeah.
these stories, was something that I could not stand by. And I needed to go and hear it for myself and bring those stories back to an American public. And people have been thankful, because if not for me, if not for a few other journalists, those stories would never be told. The stories of tens of thousands of people being displaced violently by the TPLF right now. And that's what I found when I was in Bahar Dar.
Exactly. Let's also talk about the TPLF propagandists and their Western media lobbyists feeding each other. What you see on the Western media outlets is nothing but a reflection of TPLF's barrage of insults against Ethiopia, right? How should Ethiopia cope with such challenges?
They have access and they have control of people that are in different settings, again, like nonprofits, like think tanks, like universities and media, and they manipulate the stories of what the truth is on the ground in these countries. And unfortunately, the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian people have not been able to yet, and they're starting to have a voice within that narrative. And right now what we're seeing is that the TPLF is effectively controlling the narrative in all of these different spheres. And so if the media needs a quote from somebody, they just go to the academic or the person in the nonprofit that the TPLF has already gotten, and then they pull a quote from them. And so it becomes this kind of becomes an echo chamber where then everybody is saying the same thing. The TPLF is good. The TPLF should be in negotiations, which is just not the truth. And unfortunately, the Ethiopian people, the vast majority of Ethiopians, have completely been silenced because of this investment by the TPLF over 10, 20, 30 years while they were in power. They've completely been able to shape the narrative. And unfortunately, again, because a lot of Americans don't know a lot about Ethiopia, we just believe what's in the news. And unfortunately, what's in the news is not the truth.
Exactly. And Bob, the irony is that they're reporting from another country, say Nairobi, or other nations for that matter, about Ethiopia. They don't even care about seeing the realities on the ground. And now tell me, what kind of reporting is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting here in Washington, D.C. I don't know if many people know a lot about our nation's capital. In Washington, D.C., there are 700,000 people that live here, and we do not have democracy in Washington, D.C. I do not get a vote for a senator or a Congress member. I do not have representation. So the U.S. media and the U.S. government, they don't care about their own citizens having democracy. And in Southeast Washington, D.C., which is nearly 90% Black and is one of the poorest parts of the city, you have Washington Post reporters writing about what's taking place in Southeast Washington, D.C. without ever going to Southeast Washington, D.C. They refuse to drive 2 miles. They won't go 2 miles across the bridge to tell what's happening in these parts of our own city where they live.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising they're not willing to go all the way to Addis Ababa to tell the truth. They're not willing to drive 2 miles. The Washington Post refuses, or the CNNs or the New York Times or AP, all of these outlets, they refuse to go and talk to the people that are impacted by violence, impacted by capitalism, impacted by our military. Even if it's right next door to them, even if it's 1 or 2 miles away, they will not go. And so we're seeing the same thing at an international level, that they're unwilling to go to Addis Ababa and they go to Kenya, to Nairobi instead. And again, if you are 2 miles away, or if you're 1,000 miles away, if you're not on the ground, if you're not meeting with people that are impacted by violence, you will not be able to tell the truthful story of what's taking place. And it makes you wonder, why do you not go the extra 2 miles? Why do you not go from Nairobi to Addis Ababa? It is not that far. These people are intentionally leaving out the truth. It's not by accident. They didn't buy a ticket to the wrong country. They didn't say, oh, Nairobi's not in Ethiopia. They know where they are, they know what they're doing, and they're purposefully erasing the truth and telling lies.
Yeah, so it's intentional, right?
Yes.
Okay. Also, some of the schemes that the United States of America uses to twist, if you will, your hand, are imposing sanctions and inciting the people against you. And this is exactly what it has been doing for some time now, in addition to the recent military intervention threats that we're hearing. What have you made out of all of these things?
Yeah, sanctions are incredibly violent. I think in many ways in the United States, our government and our people think that sanctions are a peaceful way to try to change somebody's mind. But sanctions are incredibly violent. We have sanctions, I think, on nearly 80 countries around the world. That impacts the ability for countries to get food, to get groceries, to get medicine. These sanctions hurt countries, and they're designed to pressure the people into pressuring their own government. It's not about pressuring a government. It is directly aimed at the people of Ethiopia, these sanctions by the United States. And that is incredibly violent, and it's incredibly wrong. And it's by no means helping the country whatsoever. And as much as I explained that the United States doesn't care about democracy because we are not a democracy, I do not have voting rights in Washington, D.C., the capital of the country. We clearly do not care about democracy in Ethiopia, because if we cared about democracy in Ethiopia, the U.S. government would support the democratically elected government of Ethiopia. But instead, we try to play, oh, there's two sides, both sides need to talk. That's ridiculous. There is the TPLF, which is attacking the democratically elected government. So if the United States was honest in its word, it would not put sanctions on the country. It would support the Ethiopian government however it could. And I do not believe, unless I've missed something, that the Ethiopian government is calling for U.S. soldiers to be in the country right now. And by no means, I absolutely reject any notion of there being a U.S. military presence in Ethiopia. It will only make things worse.
We're also hearing that the USA is pushing some public figures and government officials to leave the country as part of its evil scheme of tarnishing the image of the nation. I really want to hear your say here.
Well, I think it's funny, the line, and funny, tragically funny, the line that the United States has used from Joe Biden to Jeffrey Feltman, the U.S. envoy to the Horn of Africa, has been Africa solutions for Africa problems. So why exactly are Americans dictating and telling Africa what to do? Why are American citizens, like our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, why are we so involved in Africa if we think that the solutions will come down to the African people, which I truly believe. I am pretty confident the African people and the people of Ethiopia can resolve their issues within their country. They've already addressed them loudly. In 2018, there were loud protests that kicked the TPLF out of power. So why is the United States coming in now and trying to change the rules, trying to change the outcome, trying to change the score? The game's over, and the United States is upset with how it ended. And now we're trying to put these sanctions. We're trying to dictate where different leaders go. And in many ways, if there's any group that the United States is trying to support leaving the country peacefully, are TPLF officials. There are dozens of TPLF high officials here in Washington, D.C., going on the news, going on outlets like Al Jazeera. I mean, it's remarkable that Al Jazeera had interviewed somebody, and I forget his name, from the TPLF, who has an arrest warrant for them in Ethiopia while he's here in Washington, D.C. So you actually had Al Jazeera fly over Ethiopia to interview somebody in Washington, D.C., who has an active arrest warrant in the country of Ethiopia. And so, again, it's absolutely shocking to see how the United States has involved themselves and who they continue to back in this conflict.
Yeah. Huge imperialist media of the USA have begun deliberate ignorance of the major events unfolding in Ethiopia, including the recent rally of Ethiopians that you were part of, strongly urging the USA and other Western powers to stop poking their nose into the sovereign affairs of Ethiopia. This is really a sad and a blatant denial of Ethiopian voice, which the whole world should hear, right?
No, absolutely. It was a remarkable week that I was there because it was the 1-year anniversary of the November 4th Northern Command attacks. And it was shocking to read. There's an author, journalist, Kara Anna, who writes for the Washington Post. And on November 5th of 2020, she wrote in her article, I think it was November 10th, she wrote in her article that the TPLF had taken credit for those Northern Command attacks, which they did. They struck first. They are the ones who started this conflict or the war. And yet a year later, on November 3rd, 1 year later, the same journalist, Kara Anna, in the Washington Post said it was the Ethiopian government who had started the war, who had started the conflict. So the same journalist, 1 year apart, had rewritten the history of what was taking place. And that's important because if the Ethiopian government started the war, the people of Ethiopia started the war, then when 100,000 people gather in Addis Ababa, you get the impression that those people are bloodthirsty. Those people want war. Those people want to attack the Tigray people. But that's not the truth. That's not what happened. The TPLF attacked the Ethiopian people, the Ethiopian government, and their defense forces. So when I was there, I believe on November 7th, there was 100,000 people not calling for war, but when you were there, those people were calling for peace. Those people were calling for an end of the conflict. Those people were calling for one Ethiopia. Those people did not see those who lived in Tigray as Tigrayans. They saw them as Ethiopians. That was the message that was loud and clear. And by no means did I feel unsafe. I was there. I was welcomed. I was greeted. People wanted to tell their stories. And if those from the other Western media outlets, my colleagues in Western media, they would have had the same welcoming. They would have been shown the peaceful nature of those protests. And 100,000 people, that is a lot of people in a global city, in an international city like Addis Ababa. That warrants news. That's not some story, oh, there's too much to cover today. There's too much other news. That is a huge global story. 100,000 people calling for an end of a war in a country of 115 million people, one of the most strategic cities and countries in the entire world in the Horn of Africa. This is a global story that demanded every outlet in the United States to at least cover, even for 1 minute, it deserved coverage. And yet no one was there. That is absolutely shocking. And again, as we said, that is an intentional decision. That does not accidentally happen. People made choices to not cover that, because if you cover that, it completely changes everything that's being written in Western media, and the truth is then shown and the lies are exposed.
Indeed. The other issues Ethiopia is facing is that there are only a few people that can stand up to the truth for Ethiopia, people like you. How do you think this country, this East African country, can manage this media battle with the West with such a level of support?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And if your students and young people can connect with university students here in the United States, they are the catalyst for so many movements in this country. And I think it's incredibly important to do the people-to-people diplomacy. CNN, sadly, they're not going to answer your phone call. Washington Post, probably not going to answer your phone call. But young people in this country, they know the truth. And young people know how much our country spends on its military and what we do around the world. And so I think targeting young people is so important. And I think the other thing that I heard a lot about, or that I, again, thought a lot about, was how a lot of people who are oppressed or are attacked by the US government around the world, how much they have in common. So I think of those living in Yemen right now, or the people that experience Barack Obama's violent killing of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. I think of Palestinians. I think of those living in Southeast Washington, D.C. I think of people living in Venezuela or Colombia or in Cuba. All of these different people share something in common. One, they do not want US imperialism. And two, they want to have a humanistic perspective on life. And I think if these different groups and different people around the world can start communicating, which is incredibly difficult, as you said, there are limited resources. We're up against a giant, huge empire, the world's wealthiest empire of all time, with all of its media apparatus. It is hard to fight back, but there is strength in numbers. And if different groups can start working together and making those connections, I think you'll find more power than we have right now.
Also, I think this challenge that Ethiopia is facing can be taken as a reflection of the fact that Africans haven't yet been able to solve their own problems without the intervention of the so-called Westerners, as the continent is still dependent on these foreign powers. What's your take on that, and what should be done?
Yeah. Well, I think everyone knows there that Ethiopia has not been colonized. It's an uncolonized people. So for a long time, you have survived and lived and evolved as its own people. And I think the removal of the TPLF from power in 2018 shows that Ethiopians can come together and do what's best for the collective whole, everyone, for the country. And so I think Ethiopians have offered solutions to their own issues. And the building of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a project that the United States and Egypt has been aggressively fighting back against, is Africa solutions for Africa problems. People needed electricity. And unlike the United States, who burns oil, burns coal, destroys our planet, you are building a hydroelectric plant that will transform the continent, transform the world, not just Ethiopia. And so I think there are examples of how Ethiopians have come together to present solutions to their own problems. I think it's the United States that gets in the way and actually slows down progress by Africans. It's not that the United States comes in there and helps work things out, but it's actually the United States that is causing the problems itself. And I think if we get out of the way, I think it's more about that than it is something about the Ethiopians need to do more. They need to think differently. Africans aren't smart enough, which a lot of Americans believe, sadly. I think it's the United States is making things so difficult that it becomes very difficult for different African leaders to speak together, to work together, and to continue to build one Africa.
And also, Bob, as a journalist, what do you think African professionals should do to expose foreign meddling in their sovereign internal affairs?
Yeah, I as a peace builder, in addition to being a journalist, I just deeply believe in people-to-people diplomacy, that business leaders in Africa should do their best to reach out to business leaders in the United States. There are different professional websites. I think LinkedIn is probably the biggest global professional source of people connecting with one another. I think reaching out to people who have put up lies on Twitter is strange as it sounds, to message a stranger online just to say, hey, I see what you have posted on Twitter. I live here in Addis Ababa. Do you mind if I share my story with you? Do you think we could talk a little bit about how you do business in Africa compared to how you do business in North America? I think things like that are how you change the perspective of what's taking place, is to reach out and connect with other people. Find lawyers. If you're a lawyer in Addis Ababa, reach out to me. I'll connect you with lawyers here in America. But to start those conversations, to work around the government and to work around the news is by far, I think, the best way to build peace.
And finally, Bob, as you know, Ethiopia has also issues with its neighbors, such as Egypt and Sudan, mainly in connection with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and its firm determination to lift millions out of the poverty line. Obviously, Sudan and Egypt are sulky about it. What have you observed in this regard?
Yeah, again, sadly, the United States is playing an impediment to a project that will transform the lives of millions of people. To have Donald Trump just a few years ago justify the Egyptian government in bombing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is it's just shock. It's shocking to think about. Think about my own country as an American who continues to extract and take oil from the ground, to continue to burn coal, to watch us then try to destroy or help support Egypt in destroying a hydroelectric power plant, something that we desperately need. We need these projects. These are how we save the planet. And to watch the government here absolutely push back and support the Egyptian government, push their false narratives about what the dam will do. There will not be water shortages in Egypt because of the damming of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. There will be water shortages in Egypt because of mismanagement of their own water and because of climate change. And so Egypt will blame not themselves, but they will blame the Ethiopians for what happens to their water, which is of great concern. But with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, it will not only help Ethiopians, it will help those in Sudan and it will help those in Egypt as well. This is a project that will have a regional impact across the board and can be good for everybody. And so it's absolutely devastating to hear calls for the destruction of such a vitally important project like the GERD.
Indeed. Bob, thank you so much for your wonderful ideas. And thank you for standing by Ethiopia, standing by the truth, at such critical time that Ethiopia is grappling with many issues coming from within and without.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor.
All right. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Many thanks for watching us. And till I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shifara Olako. Bye-bye.